Hi guys, welcome to today's session. We're going to be carrying on with this acrylic study of a plant with leaves, sort of like a vegetation study, still life. So last week we just blocked in, or kind of line drew in, the basic shapes of the leaves, ready for putting in a wash of, starting with a wash of kind of blocked in colour. The idea is going to be to go for a fairly kind of graphic look, and we're going to gradually refine that into something a bit more subtle, but we want to keep things fairly quick. So we're just going for the main colours as we mix. So I'm going to be talking about mixing, talking a bit about application with the acrylic. I'm keeping it as limited as possible in terms of material. So we've just got our palette. I've got down here some little palette cups just with some water, but you could use a cup, anything you've got to hand really. Nice thing about acrylics is they're water soluble. I've got some paper towel just for cleaning my brush if I need to while I'm working. I'll try to tell you when I'm doing that. Then I've kept it limited to just, I'm going to be just using this smallish brush, so just a single brush. You could use multiple brushes if you have them, but I wanted to make it as simple as possible for anyone who's not got many materials. In terms of colours, I've got some titanium white, and then I've stripped it back to just a primary palette which we're going to be mixing from. So I've just got some lemon yellow, phthalo blue green shade, which is quite good for mixing greens, and some burnt sienna, which is a sort of earthy red. Obviously, seeing as a lot of it's going to be green, we're going to be mixing a lot of greens out of these too, the blue and the yellow, but we might be making some adjustments with the burnt sienna, and we'll also be using the burnt sienna to mix our more neutral greys. So that's it really, just a 4-colour palette is all we're going to be limiting ourselves to keep it nice and simple. I always advocate a more stripped back palette for beginners or for anyone who's not super confident with mixing, just because it makes it easier to keep track of what you've mixed. So I'm going to pop some titanium white out. Not that much. It's a lot runnier, the acrylic, than when I'm using oils on this vertical palette, so they're slightly prone to almost maybe run off a little bit, but hopefully it'll stay roughly stuck to the palette even though it's vertical. But you should be able to watch me mix, which is the main advantage of the vertical palette. So I've got my yellow there. Bit of that blue. And last of all, this burnt sienna. There we go. So that's our very basic palette, minimal palette that we're going to be working with. So the first thing I'm going to do is mix up a fairly dark colour just to kind of patch in. You can see the reference, I've got it up. I'll pop it up now next to where I'm working. Just tilt across, there's a bit of space on that side of the screen to look at the reference. So I'm going to begin with mixing up a dark colour using my blue and burnt sienna. So mixing them together till we get the darkest possible colour. Not going to add any yellow into this, because the yellow is the kind of local value of that yellow is lighter than these two. So this is going to give me my darkest possible mixture from this particular set of colours. A little bit of water, and I'm going to start blocking that in where I know we've got some nice dark colours. Maybe a little bit more water than that, just to get a bit more flow. And those of you who have used acrylics in the past will know that you have to work reasonably quickly when you're working with acrylics. The drying times are much faster. But we can do a lot of sort of washes and building colours up as we go. So as I say, I'm just going for those places where I can see goes really dark behind the leaves. And that's just my starting point. There are some leaves that are very dark as well, but I'm going to mix a separate colour for those because they're going to have a little bit of green, a little bit of yellow mixed into them to make them a little bit lighter. So they stand out against this darker background. And it'll also make them just slightly greener because I want that this is the sort of background that's not leaf forms. So I want this to feel a little bit more just kind of neutral blackish. It's not a pure black because it's kind of tended towards, I'm going to ignore those extra leaves from a different plant that are draping over, so we're just focusing on this money plant's leaves. And as I say, we can go for a fairly graphic look. I don't always advocate sort of strong, bold colours, but acrylic often sort of lends itself to that approach, and we're going to start with something quite bold and graphic and then gradually work our way towards something a little bit more subtle. So I'm just going to keep going with this dark paint till it runs out. It's starting to flag a little bit, so I'm going to take a little bit more of that red, a little bit more blue, mix them together, match what I already had, add a little bit more water to it just to get a bit better flow. You're always trying to balance the amount of sort of medium, whatever you're working in, whether it's acrylic or oils, getting just the right amount of medium to get the sort of flow. So the way that you can see the way the paint is spreading, because it's fairly runny, it's traveling quite far when I try to spread it, which is what I'm after. Sometimes you go for more of a kind of dry brushy, sort of less flowy stroke. And I'm being as delicate as I possibly can with this big brush, but obviously it's not going to be able to do super fine stuff, but we're just going to sort of patch in, try to approximate what we can see, and then in the next session we're going to be using a smaller brush and starting to kind of go in with a little bit more detail. But today we're just trying to block in these values, these colours and values to start with. So keep looking back to my reference as I work. My subject is important. Mixing a little bit more up there. So you can use this freshly mixed batch just to go over top here. So just about there with all these dark tones. And I'm going to leave a fairly kind of ragged edge around it as well. Mix up just a little bit more. So you can see how it's always quite easy to mix up the colour you're after using a stripped back palette, which is what's nice about it. And we've got a bit of a sort of shadow coming in from that left side. This shadow. Just underneath the bowl as well. And then directly below that I'm just going to put a line, simplifies it a little bit, I'm going to put a line for the sort of bottom of the shelf. Adding a bit more water to try to just increase the flow of this brush stroke. Trying to keep all my edges fairly sharp, as I say. And then just a slight suggestion just to these books, a little bit on that left hand side as well, just for now. So you can see that's now kind of blocked in and framed the general form of the pot. So next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to give my brush a little bit of a clean. So I've just got my paper towel, give it a dip in my water, wipe it off. It doesn't have to be super wiped off, because we're going to be mixing immediately. I'm just using the same brush, as I say. So giving that a bit of a wipe. So the next thing I'm going to do is mix up a sort of mid-green. So I'm going to try to patch in a mid-ish green, the highlight green, which is sort of almost white, and then a slightly darker green. Actually, let's start with the darker green. And we're going to start with the darker green just by adding a little bit of yellow to that base mixture of blue and burnt sienna. So let's try this. A little bit of water. So I'm just looking for where the leaves seem to be darkest, and you can see that's a little bit more, stands out just slightly lighter as a green than that background that I'd mixed. I'm looking for anywhere where that colour is appropriate. There might be some places where it's going to go a little bit darker. I think probably this one here is going to go darker eventually. Mix up a little bit more of it. So I'm just looking for anywhere where there's a shadow cast over the leaves, usually by another leaf around it. Anywhere the leaves are just kind of naturally dark, sort of a naturally dark little leaf in there. This one's good. Probably the left-hand edge of this leaf could be pretty dark as well. And certainly pretty much all these leaves back here are, a lot of that leaf form is darker. But I can just about make it out from the background, which is what I wanted. We're going to be doing some extra sort of washes over some parts to sort of make them darker here and there, but that'll be later. So I'm just focusing. That's probably about it for the, or maybe just a little bit here, for the darkest little patches of green that we're after. So I'm going to mix up a mid green now, so that's just basically going to be mixing up something with a lot more yellow in it. Maybe a little bit of white as well, just to tone down its vividness, because these greens, quite cool sort of greens. They're not super yellowy greens that we're going for necessarily everywhere. So I'm just patching them in a pretty loose, as much as possible, quite sort of postery manner, quite graphic. So trying not to do too much blending at this stage, as I've been saying. Just keeping it really simple, the overall approach, as simple as possible. So it's not too bad for that mid green. And now I'm going to mix up a much lighter green for a lot of the rest of it. So I'm going to be using what I already have as a green as a base and just adding white to it. This isn't always how you'd work, but these leaves have very sort of pale highlights. So the bulk of them is this kind of greyish green. That's not too bad as a match, I think. So I can kind of patch that pretty much everywhere else for now. Is ideal. And as is always the case, I'm sort of relying partly on, you have to just get colours down, blocked in, before you can really start doing much with them. Because when you've got white canvas, it always gets in the way to a certain extent. You can see as I'm getting these colours in, the forms are becoming more apparent, the way the overlaps are working. just about there. Blocking all these colours over. So I'm just going to use all these extra greens just to block in the last little bits of white on the plant here and there. As I say, we're going to have lots of several opportunities to kind of go back over and adjust things, but for now I'm just trying to get all these colours blocked in fairly well. And the final thing I'm going to do with the leaves, which is going to sort of transition a bit into the pot, which will be the last thing that we do. Oh, actually, one thing I'm going to do really quickly, just take some white, a little bit blue and red. Just going to paint in this sort of tabletop a slightly different colour, but using those greens, that greenish base that we've got there already. That sort of meets that shadow cast by the pot on that side. Carries on this side, then we've got a little bit of white. Just to make a lighter colour for the top of the tabletop. That will do for now. And then the next thing I'm going to do is move to just popping some really bright white highlights for these leaves. So there's some places where they're pretty much pure white. We're getting close to pure white on these leaves. So I'm just going to look for where those are, just patch them in. And it doesn't need to be all of them, just the boldest highlights to start with. This is definitely something we'll be developing in the next couple of sessions. And just a touch more white just for the brightest bits of highlight here and there. And that's not too bad. So then the final thing is just to patch in going to be going for a more sort of warmish colour. So this is actually going to be more yellow and red mixed together just for this pot. So initially just for the shadow on the pot. It does sort of have some kind of reflected greenish qualities to it, but we'll maybe get them in later and just start with a sort of basic warmer shadow just to distinguish the pot shadow from the rest of the piece. Yes, that's most of that shadowy colour in. Maybe a little bit more up there, and then we're going to start mixing a lighter tone for this pot in light. So a little bit more yellow, a little bit more of the red, and that's going to be our kind of base pot colour. It's a little bit greenish because it's mixed slightly into the colours below, but that's fine. Just want to get it blocked in, and then we'll be leaving this till we carry on. Obviously it's acrylic, so you can just run all the lessons once they're complete and you're watching them, or if you're watching these after you can see the whole series has been added to the playlist, you can just run through them, because these are acrylics, so they're going to dry quickly. It's a fairly cool day where I'm working, so they're not drying super fast. If you're working on a hotter day or a hotter place, you'll find stuff dries a lot quicker. I'm also using, I think my white is an open acrylic, which means it's got some stuff added to it that makes it last a little bit longer. A golden open acrylic. So if you can find those, they can be quite good just for making your drying times a little bit longer when you're working in acrylics, because that's one of the things people find most challenging, I think, working with acrylics, is just handling the drying times. At least if they come from more of an oil painting background, that's the case. So yeah, that's it for this stage. So there's little bits of white here and there left, but I've basically just like whacked in all these leaves. And then next week we'll be using a smaller brush, or next session I'll be using a smaller brush and going in and refining this stuff. Working with the same sorts of colours, mixtures on my palette, but refining things and adding sort of more specific details because I'll have a smaller brush to work with. I'll probably still be using that medium-sized brush, but also a smaller one to hand. We'll be focusing in more a little bit leaf by leaf and going through it. So yeah, that's it for this session. As always, you can subscribe and see videos from myself, other teachers, interviews and all sorts like that. And you can also click the link through to the OCAD website for more info about the sorts of qualifications that the school offers. So yeah, that's it for this week, and I'll see you guys soon.